I applied for somewhere around 300 different applications. And after getting one interview, after all those applications, I landed my first software engineering job. And today's video is going to kind of go over how I prepared for that. And this was, a handful of years ago at this point, but I think that all these points still apply today. And for friends that I know that are still like trying to get into it and stuff like this, this is the advice that I can still give to them. So this video is going to cover what you can expect from those kind of initial interviews and stages of interviews. And then also like what I would do to prepare for it, what I did to prepare for it, and what I think that you can do to best improve your odds of landing a job, especially if maybe you're someone that are potentially like me and you didn't have a computer science degree, or you're applying to these jobs without any kind of practical experience, where, most jobs on LinkedIn, and unfortunately, even entry-level jobs require, 1 to 3 years of experience. So how can you kind of get your foot in the door, and what can you expect in that interview? So, you might not get a lot of interviews. So how can you make sure that you are going to be as prepared as possible? So step number one is kind of goes without saying. You have to know how to code. You have to learn the skill. Now, when do I think that you're actually ready to start applying for jobs? I think you're ready when you can start developing your own applications. So for me, when I could build my own kind of user interfaces out, like if I could go to Spotify or YouTube or something like that, and I could build out that user interface on my own, that's when I felt like I was ready to apply. And I specifically applied for front-end development jobs. And that's advice I give to people as well, is like, hey, if you are more interested in like one side of things or the other, like either back-end development or front-end development, it might be worth it to just focus on one thing as you're starting out. As when you're trying to learn full stack right out of the gates, it's challenging. It's challenging to put together a full stack application, especially if you don't have experience with computer science or anything like that, and you're just trying to teach yourself to code. So I think it can be helpful to focus on the one that you are most interested in, and then focusing on applying to either front-end or back-end developer jobs. In case you're not familiar, front-end is going to be developing the user interface, what the user sees. Back-end is going to be more working with databases, APIs, and different connections like that. So when you can start to build your own applications and you kind of build out your own portfolio of applications, that's when I'd say you're ready to start applying. Now, I personally focused on applying to more kind of startup companies, as, with larger tech companies, you're going to get probably many more data structures and algorithms questions. And in their job requirements, you'll know if you're going to get asked questions like this if the job requirements say very good knowledge of data structures and algorithms, or it mentions data structures and algorithms in their job description. Pretty good indicator that you're going to be asked in your interviews related questions. And I decided not to focus on those so much, just because to me, that was just a whole nother thing to learn. And my goal when I got into development was just get a job as soon as I can. So to do that, if I could get a job without necessarily learning full stack and without diving super deep into data structures and algorithms, now let me caveat this to where I still think having a basic understanding of computer science fundamentals is important. So having a rough understanding of like the concepts behind data structures and algorithms is still a good idea. Learning about like efficiency of your algorithms and different things like that is important to understand. So I think that you should still know those computer science fundamentals. But for me, I didn't want to go to like LeetCode and like go through hundreds of practice problems and, do that entire thing. So I decided to not go that route, but you can definitely go that route if you would like. But the general kind of process that you can expect for a startup company, and I'll also cover a large tech company as well, as I have had friends that have gone through this process and they've kind of told me all about it. So for more of a startup company, the process that it was for me, and the process that it seems to be for most of the people that I communicate with, is the first thing that's going to occur is you're going to have an initial like HR call. They are basically going to call you, make sure that you're like a real person, make sure that you're generally pretty nice, that you can communicate okay, and that like you are who you say you are. It's basically like the authentication portion of the interview process. It's not going to be like a bunch of technical interviews. I would be very surprised if they ask you, really any difficult questions. They might ask you a couple of things about like your experience. They might just clarify like, hey, did you go to school? Did you not go to school? Do you understand these different technologies? And just get a rough estimate of maybe if you're worth moving forward with. Most people kind of pass that stage. Number 2, the second stage is it could be one of two things. It's probably either going to be straight to a technical interview, or you're going to have to do some sort of like coding challenge, where a lot of companies after that HR call, or even sometimes before the HR call, they'll make you do some sort of coding challenge. Now, this is usually a fairly more basic coding challenge that takes like 5 or 10 minutes. And it's just to get an understanding of, okay, can this guy do some sort of coding? Is he at least moderately proficient in the language that he suggests that he is? So I don't think this is probably too challenging. For larger companies, this can actually be a little bit more challenging, towards like 3 timed coding problems that you need to pass in order to move on. And that's just kind of how they weed out all the applications. But for a lot of startups, you'll either not have this coding challenge altogether, or it will be more of just kind of a basic coding challenge. All right. So you have the HR call, and then you might have a coding challenge that's kind of optional. And then number 3, you're probably going to have what is called a technical interview. So this is going to be mine was with the engineering manager at my startup. And this is basically like more just like very straightforward questions about the languages that you say that you know. You also might have to write some code. And it's important to note that for like this style of interview, when you're writing code, you're not going to be in, or you're very likely not going to be in, an integrated developer environment like an IDE, like VS Code. You're most likely going to be in like a Notepad or a Google Doc, so they can see what you're doing as well. Mine was in a Google Doc. So it's probably worth it to, while you're preparing for these interviews, and I'll discuss preparation here later on, while you're preparing for these interviews, it would make a lot of sense to do some of your preparation at least, and writing out some of your code in a Google Doc, just because it can be a little bit like awkward working in a Google Doc when you don't have like all that code completion and stuff like that. So it's worth kind of doing that, just so like if you can be super smooth in a Google Doc, that just makes you look better in an application process. So I think that would be kind of worth doing there. Now, in that technical interview, you're probably going to get like generic questions about JavaScript, maybe about React, front-end development, HTML, CSS. If you're going for back-end and you say you know Python, you might get questions about Python or the framework that you might know. So like Django or Django REST framework, or like what's an API, and you might get generic kind of questions like that. So my technical interview was about an hour. My HR call was only about a half hour. And my coding challenge was just like a super basic, like 5-minute thing. So those are kind of the first 3 stages. And if you do well with all those, you will most likely still have maybe an additional kind of behavioral or just like a general conversation with someone else on that startup or on that team, or it could even be the decision maker. So it could be like, for me, I met with our process was a little bit crazy because it was a smaller team. So like each hire was like 20% of the engineering team. So, it really meant a lot to our startup. So I met with the co-founders. So 2 different co-founders. I met with my engineering manager is the guy that gave me the technical interview, but then I also met with kind of more so our person that helped with marketing and stuff like that. So I met with like a ton of people on the team. And it was just kind of like, for a couple of them, for most of them, it was just like very conversational, kind of just a get to know you conversation. But they might also ask you questions like, why'd you get into coding? Or, how do you go about solving problems when you get stuck, and kind of different things like that, like a typical non-technical interview there. And then after that, mine was done. I had like 6 or 7 interviews for this particular company and ended up getting hired for it. So I would say the only difference between that and like a large tech company is that in a larger tech company, it's probably more so going to be like an HR call. So I had a friend that interviewed at Google and he made it to the last round. Unfortunately, didn't get the job, but made it to the last round, which, hey, at Google, you're doing pretty well if you do that. So he had an HR call. Then he had just like a technical interview. So some engineer at Google he met with for about 45 minutes and did like kind of a data structures and algorithms coding question, and he coded it out. I'm not sure if it was in a Google Doc. That would make sense since it was for Google, but it was something like that. And then after he passed those kind of first two steps, then he moved on to a full day of kind of data structures and algorithms and behavioral interviews. So I think he had 2 data structures and algorithms and 2 behavioral interviews. It might have been 3 data structures and algorithms and 1 behavioral interview. And that was in person for this company. Or for Google. So that process is a little bit different, but it's not crazy different. I would say the main difference is that added full day of interviewing of data structures and algorithms that you probably just won't get at a startup, which is also why I leaned towards a startup route. Now, that's kind of more or less what you can expect there, but how do you actually prepare? Well, for one, I already mentioned, learn the skill. That's kind of a given. Make sure you have a good understanding of, for front end, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, maybe a framework like React, Vue, Angular, Svelte, something like that. Or if you're back end, know the technologies related to that. Now, what I did and what worked really, really well for me was also studying, just giving it a Google for interview questions for HTML, CSS, JavaScript, React, the technologies that I was expected to know. Because often your engineering manager is going to do the same thing. They're going to Google what are good questions to ask this person. As a lot of engineering managers, they're not in like a super technical role. So they might not have the best like coding questions to ask off the top of their head. So they might be doing the same thing. So I would say prepare those common questions for those technologies that you are expected to know. Now, that's not saying that you like don't actually know the answers to those questions or that you wouldn't know them off the top of your head. This is purely just to make you a little bit more polished. And when you're giving your answers, if you've already prepared an answer for a similar question, you're probably going to be able to like, all right, these are the points that I kind of want to hit here. And like, it's stuff that you are just preparing it so it comes across better, more confidently, which is going to help you a ton in your interview, making you seem like more of an authority and to help you land that job. So I'd study common questions for the languages that you're expected to know and the technologies you're expected to know. Additionally, I would also study common behavioral questions and prepare your responses. So this is going to be things like, when you face a challenge, how do you solve that problem? Have you ever worked in an environment that you didn't like? How did you manage that? Have you ever worked with people you don't like? How did you manage that? When you hit a problem, what do you do? How did you get into coding? Why do you like coding? I would say just Google general kind of interview questions, and you might get some of those in your behavioral interviews. That preparing for those, like I said, you're not lying. You're not like scripting out an inauthentic response. You're just using your experiences and your knowledge to better develop different points that you want to make. So it just comes off as a little bit more polished. And then once you've done that, I would make sure that you're able to answer questions about your personal projects. So people that I've interviewed in my podcast, they've mentioned to me that sometimes in their technical interview, they're not really even asked questions about like, in JavaScript, how does the sort method work or stuff like that. They're more so asked like, in your project here, how did you build this feature? And then they have to kind of explain how they built it using the technologies that they said that they used. So if you're just coding along with tutorials online and you can't actually articulate what you did in your projects and how you built your projects, they're definitely going to see that. And I would say that it would make a lot of sense to kind of have to think about your projects and think about, okay, what are common questions that they might ask? So like, how did I build the back end to this project? How did I implement authentication? What did that look like? What were some challenges that you faced in your project and how did you overcome them? These are like basic questions that you know the answer to if you built those projects. So, don't lie to yourself and say that you built a project when you actually didn't. Make sure you actually built your projects and also prepare for questions about your projects. All right. So if you're kind of starting out here, trying to land that first job, I would expect to apply for a ton of different jobs. I would also say that, taking that shotgun approach, that's what I did and it worked for me. But a lot of other people have success with trying to build a network, reaching out to people in a software engineering position at different companies and, seeing if they can build some sort of relationship with them. And then also make sure that you have learned the skill, make sure that you can build your own projects. I would say, for me, focusing on one thing, not just full stack, but maybe focusing on just front end or just back end, focusing on one thing helped me out a lot. And then also I would say that for a startup, expect an intro HR call. You might get a coding challenge. You're going to get a technical interview, and then you're probably going to get a more behavioral interview with kind of more of the decision maker of if you're getting hired or not. For a large tech company, you're probably going to get all those same steps, plus like a full day of interviewing with data structures and algorithms questions. And then for preparation, I'll prepare kind of basic answers or more polished answers to common interview questions for, the technologies you're expected to know. Also do the same thing for behavior questions that are very common, that are expected to know. What are your weaknesses? What are your strengths? Stuff like that. And also make sure that you can talk about your personal projects, actually build your own personal projects. But, if you built your personal project like 3 months ago, make sure that you can still talk about it. Because if it's on your resume, you can get asked about it. That's totally fair game. So hopefully this helps you kind of get an understanding of what you can expect, as well as how I kind of went through preparing and, how I was able to go 1-for-1 with the single kind of interview that I got with, hundreds of applications that I sent in. So I hope this helps you out, and I'll see you in that next one.